Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter J.
All right, so we are all the way up to J in the ABCs of Archaeology, and J is for I got nothing. Nothing.
Nothing. I got absolutely nothing.
Honestly, I combed all sorts of archaeology books for something that would start with a J, and I found nothing. It's not exactly a common letter in the English language that's used at the beginning of words. And even famous archaeologists, not so many famous J's that people would recognize. Yes, there's some people in academia, some people who have written some of my textbooks, but I could not find a really noted international J for archaeology. So I might as well talk about my favorite thing to discuss, me. I begin with J. Because I have nothing else to talk about, I will just give you guys a brief update on this J, Jason Cohen. When I started this archaeology show, I was in the very beginning of my master's degree, which I've now advanced through. I finished with my coursework, just finished my last paper, and now I am writing my dissertation. I hope to finish that in a couple of months, and then, if that goes well, to start on the application for the old PhDizzle. So my goal is to be a doctor of archaeology, not the kind that helps anybody. That will be a 3, 4, 5-year process of getting my PhD, but I need to do the dissertation beforehand to see what I'm getting myself in for, because I know that I love archaeology. I hope you can see that in what I'm putting out there into the public. But I just need to figure out the way that I'm actually going to engage with it. And if I like my dissertation, chances are I will like that PhD, because that is a commitment at my age. But I do promise you, my small and loyal audience, that I will continue to put out this content. I have made a commitment to do that even in the depths of my master's dissertation and PhD process. So you can maybe take a moment to let me know what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see yes of. It's great at this point, at the beginning of my journey down the algorithm, what you, the audience, actually likes to see and hear, and any comments, however hurtful and inappropriate they may be. I have thick skin. So for the ABCs of Archaeology, J for Jason. Hope you enjoyed that and continue to enjoy this show. All right, so for today's site visit, we are going just about as far away from civilization as you possibly can to arguably one of the top 2 or 3 most isolated places on Earth. Thought about from another perspective, actually, though, the original name of this place supposedly was Te Pita o Te Hanua, or the Navel of the World. So maybe it's just everything else that's so far away. Any guesses? We are going to Rapa Nui, more commonly known as Easter Island. Now, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, it is not easy to get there, and it is not cheap to get there. In fact, the only direct flights are from Santiago, Chile, or Tahiti, which itself is rather isolated in the middle of the South Pacific. But anyway, we'll talk about the practicalities at the end. Now, just in case you're unfamiliar, Easter Island is home to some of the most recognizable faces on the planet, those mysterious Moai. Now, where do I even begin? I've never done a site visit of a whole frickin' island before, so let me just try to condense it down to as much as I possibly can that will fit in a reasonable amount of time. Let's start with the Moai. On average, they are 4 meters or 13 feet high, 1.6 meters or 5.2 feet wide at the base, and they weigh on average 12.5 metric tons. So these things are ginormous. And that, what I just told you, is average. The tallest one ever erected was 10 meters high or 33 feet, although sadly he remains toppled until this day. The heaviest one is found all the way at the eastern end of the island at a place called Ahu Tongariki, which we'll talk a lot more about. He's a little bit shorter and squatter, but he weighs 86 tons.
You're not fat. You're big-boned.
That's what I said.
Now, there's about 1,000 of them, but that number keeps ticking up as more are being uncovered all the time. And that's the thing about Easter Island. Archaeologists basically live there and work constantly. However, it's never enough. The site is so remote, funds are so difficult to come by, and it's so big that as much as we know about it, we find that we don't know enough. Also, there are a few kicking around in museums around the world, such as here in London at the British Museum, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., the Anthropology Museum in Vancouver, and in Santiago, Chile, and to the Rapa Nui, that is abroad as well. Of those 1,000 or so, 90+% are made of tuff, which is basically compressed volcanic ash. And that's because the island has not one, not two, but 3 active volcanoes on it, and we'll be visiting one of those later. So more than 900 are made of this tuff, and there are about 50 that are made out of other types of volcanic ash. Now, what's really cool is that you can actually visit the source of this tuff, the quarry, which is called Ranuraruku, and there you can actually see work-in-progress Moai, and sort of them being born and emerging down the hill to maybe where they're finally supposed to have ended up. They are male in form and portrayed from the waist up, although they do have elongated heads, so people often forget about the body. They do have some basic anatomical features like navels, and some of them, it's thought the ones that came about later in time, have these red hats on. Except they're not hats. They're actually top knots of hair that were sported by the chieftains. And these were made out of a stone, another volcanic one called red scoria. And we also know of the quarry site for those on the island at a place called Puna Pau. Now this red scoria is pretty fragile, so it easily falls victim to wind and rain erosion. So a lot of those pukao didn't survive very well. And there's even 17 of the Moai made out of the red scoria. But yeah, those generally didn't fare too well either. However, there is one that's very unique, and I should point out, which is made out of red scoria, and it's kneeling in form. So that one is kind of one of a kind. Now, many of the Polynesian people around the Pacific share some common beliefs. And one of those is in mana, which is sort of a spiritual essence or power. And that is believed to be kept or stored in the hair, so those pukao are important. And some of those Moai are believed to have had eyes, although none of those survived. Now, the whites of the eye were made out of coral, and the pupils either obsidian or more of that red scoria. And that was figured out in relatively recent times by reassembling some broken pieces of those material that were found around the bases of the Moai. So that's how they figured out that at one point there were eyes. But any you see today are reconstructed. And where are these Moai located? Pretty much everywhere, though a few points bear some explanation. First of all, some of them are solitary, some are in pairs, and some are in ahu.
Lincoln, I'd like you to meet Achu.
A Jew? Yeah?
No, not a Chew or a Jew, ahu.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean, the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
Never mind. These ahu are platforms made out of basalt or other volcanic rock, atop which some of the Moai sit. And it's thought that these Moai, which are together like that, are part of the sort of same family or clan or tribe, of which there were multiple on the island at any given time. Now, perhaps the most impressive and most photographed I already mentioned, which is Ahu Tongariki on the island's eastern side. However, if you look closely at the photo, you'll notice one very strange thing, which is that none of the Moai are taking advantage of their great seafront property. They're all looking inland. And I'm going to begin to sound like a broken record here, but there's so much about Easter Island Rapa Nui that is not really known and still debatable, and this is one of those points. However, a leading hypothesis for why this is the case, they're looking inland, is that these Moai, these elder spirits, they're looking inland at the land that's belonging to their descendants who have erected them. So they're kind of looking out over the land either to convey ownership or, direct good luck or manna at the land of their tribe. However, how did the Moai get to where they ended up? Like many things, we just don't know, but there are lots of ideas. One thing that seems pretty clear is that they were brought upright because we can see some that seem to be descending from the quarry there at Rano-Raruku. How that was accomplished, though, remains to be seen. Some claim they were put on wooden rollers. Some claim there were sort of trackways all around the island for this purpose. Some think they were put on wooden sleds. And some even believe they sort of walked by being rocked back and forth with ropes. But we just don't know. There's been a lot of experimental archaeology done to this effect to try to figure it out, to see how many people it would have entailed and how long it would have taken. Okay, yeah, so that last one, not so much. But not all of this was done to be experimental. Actually, according to one traveler's account from 1868, at that time, none of the Moai on Oahu were standing upright. Now, I'm not sure if that's totally accurate, but it seems like most of them were down by that point. And by the 20th century, people started trying to, and succeeding to put them back upright. But this begs the question, how did they fall in the first place? So for this, we're going to have to take a deep dive right into history.
90, 34 years of age, Jeremy Wells!
The Rapa Nui, which is the name for both the island and the people, discovered the island way back in about 800. And that's the date that most archaeologists believe in. For example, Joanne van Tilburg, probably the archaeologist most noted for her long decades of work on Rapa Nui, favors this 800 date based upon carbon dating of materials done around the Ahu. However, not everyone is on the same page. Another archaeologist, Terry Hunt, based on carbon dating information at settlement sites, argues more for 1200. Now, what he's saying is not without evidence, but it's definitely not bought into by the majority, and it is still a controversial opinion. So probably around 800, but some are arguing 400 years after at 1200, which is when the Rapa Nui arrived at Rapa Nui. Where did the Rapa Nui come from? Well, that's not exactly known, though ADNA specialists are certainly on the job. However, the top candidates are the Marquesa Islands and the Gambier Islands, which are both part of French Polynesia. And how did they get to Rapa Nui? Well, at least that's not such a mystery. As demonstrated by Norwegian Thor Heyerdahl in his 1947 Kon-Tiki expedition, they either took canoes or catamarans, and that's what he did. Now, if you'd like to see the Kon-Tiki, as I did, you can go to Oslo, where it still resides today. So the Rapa Nui were out on Easter Island all on their own, 2,000 kilometers or 1,300 miles away from the nearest island. And they developed this religion that bore similarities to other religions in Polynesia, but definitely being so isolated they made it their own. And again, the basic concept is this concept of mana, spiritual power, which is stored in the stone, in the Moai, and that's how people can access it. So the Moai were created for about 300 or 400 years, starting in the year 1200, and they underwent several phases of development. But actually, not all was well. You see, the greatest source of environmental information about the island, its environmental history, is from the layers of sediments, especially at the bottoms of the crater lakes, and there's a few of those, but also some around the settlements as well. And those undeniably tell us two things. First, they showed the arrival of Polynesian rats, which were certainly stowaways with the first humans to arrive, or perhaps food. And what do we know about rats? They like to eat stuff. So there was even ancient bits of seeds and shells that had rat gnaw markings on them. And that upset the delicate ecosystem of the island. Secondly, very soon after people arrived, we saw a dramatic decrease in the pollen count, a reduction and eventual extinction of many of the animals on the island, especially land birds. So almost as soon as people arrived, there was a major threat to biodiversity. But the big debate is what role the rats versus the humans had in all of this. Terry Hunt, once again in the minority, he believes it was mostly the rats. A lot of others seem to think people had something to do with it. Through their farming and exploitation of the land, they committed a kind of an ecocide, which caused a collapse in the environment in the island. Now, the person to term this ecocide and develop this theory was Jared Diamond, and what he said has become a bit more controversial now. He essentially said that the people destroyed the environment, and as that happened, they came into conflict with each other. The population boomed, but then as resources became more scarce, it dwindled. People started fighting, resorted to warfare, and even cannibalism. And some of the evidence for this is the burning that's found in those layers of sediments at the lake. So burning probably had to do with slash and burn agriculture or burning down the forests, potentially maybe some fighting too. This was countered by Terry Hunt and others who said, look, we don't really see archaeological evidence either in artifacts or skeletons for violence. And we don't see evidence of a large-scale population decline if we look at the settlement archaeology. So how exactly the island came to have a population of about 3,000 and be almost totally denuded of trees or large animals, we're not sure. But that's how it was found by the first Europeans who arrived there. Dutchman Jacob Roggeveen was the first European to spot the island on Easter Day in 1722, which is how the island became known as Easter Island, commonly to outsiders. A few other expeditions came in the 1700s, including that of the famous Captain Cook in 1774. And some of these expeditions reported that some of the Moai were toppled at this point. You see, the whole cult around the Moai seems to have been abandoned in the late 1500s, and in its place, this mysterious birdman religion. Now, not much is known about how this came about, other than the birdman started to appear in paintings and petroglyphs. And there are some similar things in Hawaii and maybe some other places. And slowly the whole center of spiritual gravity in the island seems to have moved far south in the village of Orongo, which overlooks both the sea and the volcanic crater there all the way in the southern part of the island. And what I'm about to tell you is on a little bit more solid ground because it was recorded in writing in a language we can understand by some travelers, but we'll get into more of that later. Now, what made Orongo village so strange were these stone houses that were built there, some of them round, some of them elliptical, and also, oddly, some oblong ones which were made to house chickens. So yeah, pretty weird. Chickens get their own house in this village. But it's important to point out this wasn't a village where like normal people with families lived. It was a village where a priestly class lived, who looked at the stars and told prophecies. You see, at this point, the Moai were no longer seen as conduits to access the manna through the ancestors. That role was now taken by the birdman, known in the local language as Tangata Manu, who now was the way to do that. And he was associated with the god Make Make, or the god of creation. And it was through him now that people believed they could access this manna, so he was now the center of the religion. And there was a human embodiment for this Tangata Manu, who was picked through a very dangerous, death-defying, and elaborate ritual. You see, the priestly class at Orongo village, I think it was once a year, would select representatives from each clan from below the nobility, because this was a stratified society, so there were chiefs and, the higher level clique. And with these candidates picked, Everyone else would go home. They would leave Orongo village. The only other people who would stay behind is one sponsor or benefactor of each competitor that was selected by the priests. Now, I was there on a stormy day, which made this whole thing that much more foreboding. The whole competition was timed for the return of Easter Island of a migratory bird called the sooty tern, and they'd be coming back to lay their eggs. So that's, I guess, what the priests were sort of looking for to the stars and calculating the return of this bird to lay its eggs on Easter Island. Anyway, the men who were competing were to find the first egg of the sooty tern, somehow scale those cliffs down to the water, swim out through the rough seas to that rocky islet Moa Nui, scale the sheer cliffs back up Moa Nui, and when they got to the top, shout their name back to their benefactors on the mainland, and then they would be declared the winner of the competition. And if that sounds dangerous, it was. Lots of people died from falling, drowning, and even shark attack. Now, the next phase was a little less dangerous. At that point, the sponsor or benefactor of the winner would lead everyone down to the beach and kind of throw a party in his honor.
Hi, Barbie.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Barbie. Hi, Barbie.
Hi, Barbie.
Then the winner would be declared Tangata Manu, the birdman, and he would have to go into seclusion for 6 months, although he got to wear a headdress made of human hair and a bunch of fancy clothes. And during the period of his seclusion, he was not supposed to do anything other than eat and sleep, and the food was brought to him as sort of donations by other people. And this would complete his transformation into the birdman, and now he was able to access the mana of the ancestors, or through the ancestors, I should say. And for the next year, his clan got exclusive rights to harvest the eggs of the sooty tern, and this would all change again the next time there would be a competition. Now, this all lasted until 1878, I believe, when the Catholic missionaries from the mainland suppressed all of this, and the whole population had already been converted to Catholicism. And this brings us to the very, very sad part of all this story, which is that the modern history of Rapa Nui, since contact with Europeans, has been an absolute humanitarian and cultural disaster. With the arrival of Europeans in the 17 and 1800s, diseases began to spread on Rapa Nui, because of course, having been an isolated population, the Rapa Nui did not have immunity to these diseases. And this came at a bad time because, remember, there was the environmental decline of the island, which led to increasing competition among the factions and clans. Now, did this make it all the way to ecocide, as Diamond said? That's controversial, but it was at a time of competition and ecological troubles. And though the details aren't known, this is the time when the Moai really began to get toppled. And it seems that this was because the clans and factions were fighting on the island. This competition had broken out into violence. And why did they knock the Moai down? Maybe to claim the other clans' land, to bring bad luck on them, to curse them. But this is what was happening. Recall, in the 1700s, the travelers reported a few of them were down. And by the 1860s, many of them were down, and supposedly all of the ones on the Ahu had already been knocked down by that point. And if that weren't bad enough, in 1862, there was a slaving expedition that arrived from Peru. And in that expedition, those Peruvian slavers carried off half the whole island, about 1,500 men, women, and children off to be slaves. And again, those people not having immunity to the diseases, almost all died of smallpox. And only about 15 or 20 of them returned to Easter Island, Rapa Nui, in the 1870s, once slavery had been abolished in Peru. Now, they were the lucky ones who had somehow had natural immunity to smallpox or survived it and then gained immunity. But guess what? Their families, who probably welcomed them with open arms and felt they were so lucky to be, have among their family the 15 to 20 survivors, they weren't so lucky. So yeah, now smallpox spread on the island and turned into an epidemic, and tons of people died. And as if it couldn't get any worse, this compounded a tuberculosis epidemic that was spread with the arrival of those missionaries who at this point had abolished the birdman cult. And so many people had died that foreigners started buying up the land on Easter Island. And one of these was Jean-Baptiste Dutrou-Bornier, a wealthy Frenchman who had sugar interests in French Polynesia, and now he turned much of Easter Island into a sheep ranch, which did not require so many hands. But guess what did? Sugar plantations. So he deported a lot of the population of the islands almost as serfs to work on his sugar plantations in French Polynesia. And this then brought him into conflict, all of this upheaval, with the Catholic missionaries. So for their own safety, they deported a lot of the population of Rapa Nui, hundreds of people, off to the Gambier Islands. And by 1877, the population hit rock bottom. There were only 111 Rapa Nui left on Easter Island due to the slavers, disease, and those missionaries doing God's work. In the 1860s and 70s, the population declined by 97%. All of those people were either dead or exiled. And to make matters worse, all of the nobility was gone, who of course were the cultural elite, and all of the people who could read the native script Rongo Rongo were dead. So at this point, the people, the culture, and the language of Rapa Nui was on the verge of extinction. And in fact, the way that a lot of the culture and religion was known was through oral history, because no one was left who could read that script. And luckily, a British lady named Catherine Routledge arrived in 1914. She was an archaeologist and an anthropologist, and she was the first one to really do an extensive archaeological survey of the island. And the other thing she did, she wrote a lot of stuff down. She talked with the Rapa Nui and wrote their stories and their memories of what happened down in her books. Luckily, there was a few left from the 1860s who still knew the old ways. And Catherine was aided in communicating with them by Juan Tepano, a Rapa Nui man who had actually had adventures on the mainland and fought in the army and returned back to Rapa Nui. But even him, although he was an invaluable source for translating for Catherine, he himself had trouble understanding pure Rapa Nui, the language before it had been adulterated by Spanish. So you can see how precarious the whole thing was. Anyway, it was Routledge who recorded all that stuff about the birdman, stuff about the native tattooing practices, which she detailed in drawings, and a lot of the history and culture, and that's how it survived. So we have her and Juan Tepano to thank. Now, since then, the culture and the population of Rapa Nui has rebounded, so thankfully, so that was a low point. But the Rapa Nui, the people of Rapa Nui, still face a lot of obstacles in their struggle for autonomy. After years of disenfranchisement, the Rapa Nui have achieved a degree of self-governance and representation in the national government. However, they're still fighting for more, and they have many international organizations of indigenous people on their side. However, progress has been made. In 2018, control of the archaeological sites and heritage was officially passed from the central government over to the locals. And that same year, there were limits on the number of flights that could arrive and the amount of time that non-locals could stay on the island. That was cut down to 30 days. So because of this, the population of the island, which I think had hit 7,000 in maybe the early 2000s, well, that was cut down to a much more sustainable level of about 3,000. And because those permanent residents were all native-born Rapa Nui, this meant the money, and not only the control, the money, the funds, the benefits of that tourism flowed into the local communities. This took a lot of pressure off the environment, but it still faces a lot of threats. There has been a sudden spike of factory fishing from boats that come from afar, and this has devastated local fish stocks, leading to international protests by the Rapa Nui and Chile and the foundation of a marine park. And in 2022, there was a fire that spread, charring some of the Moai, and it was believed this was set deliberately, probably through, agricultural practices. Not wantonly, but the damage was still done. Now, this fire happened at Rano Raruku. That was that quarry site, which there's a big concentration of Moai there, more than 300, and also one of those crater lakes we discussed. Now remember, those are repositories for the environmental history of the island, and I was told by an archaeologist very active there that this may have damaged the sedimentary record, so this could actually limit our understanding of the island. I'm not sure if that has been sorted out yet. And finally, though local control is a good thing, the island was rocked by a major corruption scandal in which the head of the local cooperative that administers the sites seems to have bankrupted the group by doling out lots of money to his family. And this became so contentious that actually violence broke out in 2020. Now, I'm not sure of the latest status, but it still seems that there's a court case active on this, and that's in fact why that violence broke out in 2020, as different factions were fighting over the court proceedings. There's also the question of repatriation, which isn't so simple, because remember, there are a handful of these things all around the world in major museums, and as I discovered, there are smaller ones also abroad. I was in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford the other day, and I spotted this small guy, and I was unaware that he was there. And while a committee of the island's elders have demanded that ownership of all the Moai be transferred to them, ownership doesn't necessarily mean return. You see, there was a recent kerfluffle that ensued when the British Museum posted a photo of the Moai that's there on social media. And this was met by a mob of social media users who sort of bombed the museum's social media accounts demanding repatriation. The trouble with this was these were not Rapa Nui. In fact, one of the leaders of it was a Chilean guy who, remember, the Rapa Nui don't really consider themselves Chilean. So at this point, the mayor of Rapa Nui called on people not to politicize the issue, and also sort of echoed Hosni Mubarak, the former Egyptian president, when he referred to Nefertiti as Egypt's greatest ambassador. The mayor of Rapa Nui said the Moai abroad, like the one at the British Museum, also served as great ambassadors. What I can say is that the Rapa Nui have faced so much devastation from outside forces, but they literally bounced back from the brink of extinction. Now, I was there in December 2018, January 2019, right after the sites had been transferred to the locals for administration, the stays of outsiders limited to 30 days, and those flight limits put in place. And what I can tell you is the people I spoke to were happy and hopeful and looking towards the future. So I have confidence that they will be able to figure it out. As for the archaeology, although the place has been under continuous study for the last seems like many decades, and archaeologists are basically a permanent presence there, there's still so much that needs to be learned, and it seems like there are many places that haven't been studied yet in depth. It was described to me by an archaeologist who works there as almost like a Wild West. Restoration is ongoing, and it's done amazing things. It's righted a lot of the Moai, and in fact, in 1960, there was a tsunami that struck the island, and it pushed Ahu Tongariki inland and toppled some of the Moai. Now, by 1990s, that had been restored to its former glory, and with the continuous work of archaeologists, which is ongoing, I have no doubt that the island will be restored, at least in some sense, to its more pristine past. Last but not least, let's talk about visiting there. It's a challenge. It's so far away from everything and it ain't cheap. And my guess is after COVID, during which it was closed for I think almost 2 years through 2022, there is still a backlog of people looking to go there. But if you can swing it, it's definitely worth it. Now first, make sure to contact a local company, a Rapa Nui based company directly, and work through them. That way they get a bigger cut of the money and it will probably be cheaper for you, not paying off some outside group as a middleman. Spend at least 3 days there because there is a lot to see. And look, you've already spent a fortune going there and staying there. 1 extra day is not going to break the bank more than it's already been broken. And as there is so much to see, you'll want some downtime to take a break, and you can definitely do that there too. And one thing you'll note is, outside Hangarau, the major town center, there's not very good internet there. So as you sort of become de-techified, time will slow down. And even the most tech addicted to you will start to relax and slow down a little bit too. And remember to be responsible tourists. It's already a fragile ecosystem, so pay careful attention to your rubbish, your water usage, etc. And look, you're definitely going to want guides to interpret the sites to you, particularly the complicated ones, like the warren of subterranean stone buildings at Orongo Village, or at that quarry where you can see those Moai in the process of being born and descending that hill. Trust me, the explanations are going to help. So how does it benefit for you to drive on your own to these sites and then maybe meet up a guide there? You might as well get driven and save the environment a little bit. And as it is a relatively flat island and usually a pretty moderate climate, it is a great place for biking, so rent a bike. So use that bike to explore and get a little exercise. And make sure to interact with the local people. Do that at their church, at the beach, in the store, in the street. Because remember, this is not a dead place. It's not an open-air museum. It's a living, breathing community, and the locals are great. And another tip, try to avoid June through August, as that's the rainiest time of the year and there are some serious storms then as well. Visiting Easter Island was one of the most memorable experiences of my life, and I'm so privileged to be one of the few who's been able to do that, and I hope you can find yourselves among those ranks. It's not easy to get there, but I definitely recommend it 100%. 6 out of 5 stars.
Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News. The news you can trust.
Alright, so given today's super long site visit to Easter Island, I'm just going to do one story for Archaeology News that's hit the headlines recently. And this is kind of from a different angle of stuff we've talked about before. Now, we're all familiar with the term microplastics, probably mostly associated with the oceans. It's an environmental problem. You may have heard there's that sort of big garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific, which I actually think is 2 different patches kind of swirling around, and a lot of that is plastics. In total, it's supposedly 3 times the size of France. So it's huge, and it's a big environmental problem. But research has found microplastics everywhere, in the atmosphere, in food, and even in the human body. Well, even archaeology isn't safe from this stuff, according to some new research published in the journal Science of the Total Environment. Now, in this project, some scientists from the University of Hull, archaeologists from York Archaeology, and an archaeologist from the University of York analyzed some soil samples taken from the northern English city of York. Well, this was a good spot from which to take samples because the city center of York has had continuous human habitation since Roman times at least. Now, the Romans founded a fort there called Eboracum, which supposedly was taken from the earlier Welsh of Eburacon, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, I don't speak Welsh. And the Romans founded that Eboracum in 71 AD, just within a couple decades of their invasion of Britain, so that's how quickly they made it up north. After the Romans left and the Anglo-Saxons came in, they sort of transliterated the name to Ephorwic, which should mean something like the yew tree market town. And then, of course, the Vikings stormed in, and they made York the center of Viking Britain, and they kind of bastardized the name to Jorvik. And one of these days, I'm definitely going to have to do a site visit to the Jorvik Viking Center, because I've heard that is awesome, though a little bit difficult on your nose, but that's another story. Anyway, there have been many, many fruitful excavations in the city of York, because basically any time anything is built, you have to have an archaeological survey, and pretty much they find stuff could be as old as Roman times. And here's the really depressing part. The project tested samples from 2 sites in the center of York, and these actually had been excavated in the 1980s. And they tested soil as far down as 7.3 meters or 24 feet. So that's a long way down, all the way to Roman times. And they actually found microplastics down that far. Now, to be honest, when I first heard this, I thought, okay, that's not good. We've altered the environment. But from an archaeological perspective, who really cares? I mean, plastics can be separated from the organic matter, sort of sifted out, right? So it shouldn't really change anything.
Wrong!
In fact, as the project showed, these microplastics do alter the soil chemistry, and that can actually cause organic remains to decay. Now remember, how are organic remains preserved either in the soil under the ground or in water, like those bog bodies we talked about? Well, they're preserved because of anaerobic conditions, the lack of oxygen. And what's been found is that microplastics in the soil change the soil chemistry, and that might be able to introduce oxygen through chemical processes, which would lead to the breakdown of organic remains. Now, why this is such a big deal is, you remember sort of a golden rule in archaeology is the preference to preserve things in situ unless they're threatened by something like development. Well, now if microplastics in the soil will lead to a degradation of those remains, maybe we have to rethink that golden rule. More research needs to be done because the paper left it as a hypothetical. We know the soil chemistry has changed, but we don't yet know the effect of that on the organic remains. But the fact that this is a possibility is worrying. No positive spin here. We know that due to rising sea levels from climate change, a lot of coastal archaeology is threatened. Even remember from, I think it was my very first site visit to Cosque Mediterranee, that's a subsea cave, which even though it's under the water is dry. However, rising sea levels are beginning to cause it to flood, and it will probably be flooded, in our lifetimes, which is why the replica of that cave was made to preserve it. So now we face yet another environmental threat. So yeah, consequences. Not even archaeology can escape the environment. Nothing can. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.